Now, thanks again for joining. Please stay. We have some exciting things for you to do. We'll go through a lecture and some exercises, and then really have some hands-on on a virtual desktop. So without further ado, I'd like to give the word to Craig. Craig is our trainer for today. Craig, please introduce yourself. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Roger. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see BDD live workshop.
Yep.
So who am I? Well, I'm Craig Pearson. I'm a trainer and coach. Starting on the right-hand side, I've been in IT for quite a long time now, longer than I care to remember. And in recent times, I've been working across the Agile and DevOps domains since about 2012. So I've got a range of certifications, and I've partnered with companies like Noble to help deliver training sessions across that broad spectrum of Agile, testing, DevOps, and SRE. So I've probably conducted about 100 and something training sessions now, so quite a few sessions. Obviously, due to COVID, a lot of stuff is online training nowadays. One day we may get back to classroom sessions, but the thing about all the training is it is very immersive and very interactive. So that's me. I'm based in the northeast of England, Newcastle upon Tyne, but have been delivering coaching and training both UK-wide and internationally. Been an interesting year this year because I was nominated to be one of the DevOps ambassadors by the DevOps Institute in recognition of the work I've been doing in the DevOps space. So that's me. The session today is a BDD. We've called it a live workshop because what we're going to do is walk through some of the theory of what BDD is, what does it mean, but then we'll all get practical. We'll walk through some examples and come up with some BDD files, which hopefully give you a flavor of how powerful the technique can be. It's a very useful technique, becoming much more widespread. And if you want to go further and learn more, then obviously reach out, get in touch with Noble, and we can do dedicated workshop sessions on real problems, on real life problems, which will hopefully, solve some of the challenges you are facing. So what is BDD and why do we need it? Well, in our tech space, in our digital space, we're quite often coming from different disciplines, and we're all speaking slightly different languages. So you have the scenario where your business stakeholder is asking for something, probably on behalf of a customer. So wanting to encourage new users to buy in our online shop, things like we'd like to give them a 10% discount. So in plain language, we can talk about what our users are after. However, if you're a developer, quite often you're thinking in development terms, functions and classes, and in the sort of the technical detail. Likewise, if you're a tester, quite often you're immediately thinking, how do you test what the user wants to do? How can we prove that what we've built and matches the user specification? In this sort of triangle of languages between the business, the developer, and the tester, can sometimes result in mismatch, misunderstanding, complexity. And what we'd like to do is try and get a single language to unify all of those conversations. And we use a BDD kind of language to do that. And we'll go into the detail in a moment, but it allows a bit of structure to be applied to plain language. And that structure can then be useful when you come to build and test the actual service or product that you need. So it's a language that weaves together business stakeholders, developers, testers, and anybody else who's interested in building and running services. So that's the rationale and why BDD is becoming more popular and more useful. The language itself, you'll detect that there's quite a strong food analogy running through some of this. The language is called a thing called gherkin. So what is gherkin? Well, first of all, where does it come from? So BDD stands for behavior-driven development. It's a way of looking at and encoding user behaviors. It is building on an approach called test-driven development. A technical development technique originally created by Dan North, which placed testing much earlier in the software development life cycle. And behavior-driven development is building upon that. So the reason we have BDD is because even in agile teams, we have things called user stories, and user stories are quite often difficult to test. They're quite open and ambiguous. So BDD is an attempt to try and overlay some structure around how a user would behave. So we have user stories to enable agile delivery in their a topic of their own. But what we want to do is add a bit more structure to the through BDD, so that these user stories can be turned into something that can be implemented and potentially automated. So the stuff in red at the bottom is an early sort of snapshot of what the Gherkin language is about. It talks about giving an initial context, and it's about reacting to events, and then just making sure that the user behavior, the user outcome, is the one that is expected. And this is the main language you hear when you're talking about BDD and Gherkin. You get into the habit of saying given, when, then. There's some of the keywords in this particular language. So BDD enhances user stories. It enhances things like test criteria, acceptance criteria, and allows us to codify and apply some structure to user behaviors, which can then be used to more effectively build and test systems. So that's the rationale, that's the history. Gherkin itself is a very simple, straightforward language. It's not as complex as some programming languages. Basically you just express lines of text. It's not like some languages where if you get an apostrophe in the wrong place, everything breaks, or if the white space is not in the right place, things go wrong. So it's just lines of text. And it has quite a narrow set of words that you can use. Features and scenarios, given, when, then, and but. So there is quite a narrow syntax that we use, which makes it powerful because everybody can understand this. Everybody from the business, from the technical side, from the testing side can get on the same page with this language and really create some powerful scenarios. But first of all, it starts with users. It's very much a language that we use when engaging with our users. So at this point here, I was going to try and get interactive with the audience. So what I'd like to do is just throw it out there. What kind of users are people sort of working with? If you want to post in the chat channel, what I'll do is I'll try and capture some detail on the kinds of users. So, okay, I'm getting some feedback through the chat channel here. What kind of users are you working with? Well, some are working with taxpayers, some must be in the government space. Okay, so online banking users, yeah, that makes sense. Yes, some of you are in the online banking space. Maybe you want to withdraw cash or manage cash in their banking. Gaming users, so sort of online. You're talking online platforms, that kind of thing. Yep. Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so from what I'm picking up, there's a range of different kinds of users that you interact with, and this is the key part of BDD. It is very much about the users. You use this technique as soon as you start talking about features that users want in any real detail. And the sort of first evolution point when talking with users is to capture what we call a user story. What is the functionality that user wants? So the structure of user stories, if you've never seen them before, follows this kind of pattern. As a role, as a kind of user, I want to achieve some action so that I achieve some outcome. So what I was going to do here is again reach out to some of the users in the chat. Let me sort of try and draw out some features or user stories that you are working with. So feel free to post in the chat some high-level features you'd like me to roll into a user story. So okay, it's quite a straightforward one there. So banking user wants to withdraw cash or transfer cash. Makes sense. Yeah, let's do that. What else is happening there? Okay, taxpayer wanting to check tax they owe. Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, so there's some thanks for the feedback in the chat channel there. That's good to know. What we can do then is start to put these into a user story. So let me try and keep things nice and simple for the course of today. So I'm going to look at the banking user situation here. So if somebody said they want to be able to transfer cash online. So if you remember the user story format, it's as a, I want to, so that. So we know who the user is. So it's as an online banking user. I want to transfer, and what's it saying? That's probably between accounts. Just going to check with the participant there. Yep, it's transfer cash between accounts so that I can, what's it for? Pay bills, yep, save money, etc. So there's a variety of reasons, but that, if you've never seen a user story before, that is a user story. We'll call it transfer cash. So the user story has a name. We've then followed that as a I want to, so that kind of structure. Now, user stories, very useful, very popular agile technique. They're a way of engaging with your users, talking about functionality, and just getting a high level plan of what your users want, pulling together. Again, like most things here, we could spend a full day talking about the details of user stories. And if you want to do a user story writing workshop, get in touch. Again, this is something we can and do run for organizations if they're struggling to capture meaningful agile requirements, or if they're trying to use user stories and just not finding the right level of detail. So reach out if you want to do a bit of a deeper dive on those. But in summary, that's what we have. We have a user story which explains what the user is trying to achieve and the reason why. Okay, what we would typically then do, as this user story gets closer to being delivered, we want to know a bit more about it. Typically, we would start to capture some things like acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria are those things that we would basically want to tick off to confirm the user story has been delivered. Things, that we can test ultimately, but things that just guarantee that when we build the product to satisfy this user story, that it does what it's supposed to do. Okay, so we can add detail to user stories by adding these things, acceptance criteria, or sometimes known as conditions of satisfaction. Quite a big description there, but basically that just means acceptance criteria. What we can also do is, if that original story is quite big, we can break it down into multiple stories. And quite often, if you have lots of acceptance criteria on a story, it's probably worth breaking it down into some sub-stories. But let's think about the acceptance criteria then. So as I mentioned, they can form new stories if there's quite a few of them, or typically what we can use them for is just to define the boundaries of what we are working with. Okay, so I was going to again go back to the chat channel. What I'd like to do here is just try and capture some acceptance criteria against, well, we'll stick with this story then. So we've gone down the online banking route. So what's the acceptance criteria for this one here? Okay. Just looking at the chat channel there's something coming through. So what will we check? Money has left account. Well, that's the origin account here. Money has been received. I'll just say money is in the receipt. Okay, somebody's also saying in there might be a limit, so limit, daily limit. Say euros, dollars, or pounds. I'll stick with pounds because I'm UK based. We might say the daily transfer limit of 200. Again, this is hypothetically speaking. Somebody's also mentioned user needs to log in, verify themselves. That's obviously quite important. So, okay, so again, we don't have too many of these things yet. Hopefully that's given you a flavor of the kind of things we would check when we are implementing a transfer cash sort of online user story. These are the things that we typically would look at and say, right, okay, we've built the feature. How can we test it? Money's left the account. Yep, we can check that. Money's in the receiving account. Yep, we could check that. Has it exceeded the limit or not? We could obviously validate that. And obviously we could validate that the user has logged in. So, okay, so quite quickly in the space of what, 15 minutes there, we've walked through a typical, scenario that's happening in lots of businesses and lots of companies, every single day. Stakeholders are asking for new features. People are getting together to discuss those features. People are writing user stories, typically putting them into a backlog for delivery. As and when they get closer to being delivered, we want to talk to the users about acceptance criteria. And it's at this point here where BDD starts to help. Because what we've got with these acceptance criteria is something that's quite high level, but still open to an element of interpretation. We may need a bit more detail there to be able to build the right feature, but also to test and validate that. BDD scenarios are those things. They take these acceptance criteria and look at the user behavior involved and just try and create specific scenarios so that we can validate that the feature is working as intended. So through conversations with users, we ask them, their expected behavior. So what do we mean by login and verify? Typically you would have a conversation which would say, okay, the username and password is valid. Okay, you might say stuff like, okay, how do we check that the money's left the origin account? Well, we might want to add some data values and say, given I have £100 in my account, when I transfer 50, then I expect 150 to be remaining. So this is where BDD starts to add a bit more granularity, which we can then use both to build and test the service. And the powerful thing about BDD and BDD scenarios is these are things we can then automate. So we can turn BDD scenarios into real automated tests that we can run time and time again very, very cheaply. So again, another useful angle for BDD is if you're struggling to introduce any test automation. So if you're still doing lots of manual testing, then going down a BDD process can start to capture scenarios that we can more easily automate. And these then become part of your automated test pack, which ultimately is about building, better quality products for the long term. So what's the format of these things then? So we've said we've got a user story with acceptance criteria. Typically what we would do is take one of those acceptance criteria and create some scenarios. And what we would do is say, right, okay, for a particular scenario, such as transferring money, we put the system into a given state, a given context, and you can have multiple different conditions there. You can say, given the login screen and I have entered my username, you could then have some events. So when I enter a correct password, then I expect the outcome to be I am onto the home page. So that's a very, very simple scenario. And that's a sort of positive outcome scenario. Typically, you would write those kinds of scenarios, but then also start to add some other scenarios, which are, right, okay, what if something goes wrong? So same given context, when I am presented with the login page, when I enter an incorrect password, then the outcome should be different. I expect to see the invalid login page and I am asked to start again. So it's starting to take sort of vague, ambiguous acceptance criteria and turning them into something much more system specific and potentially with values in. And these become more powerful and things that can then ultimately be implemented and tested. So how do we get started with some of this then? So we've talked about the theory. It's now we're sort of getting on with the practice. So Gherkin itself is a language, it's a syntax. And what we would typically do is work with a text editor of our favorite, of our preference. And we would typically install a plugin that would give us access to the Gherkin language. And that's useful because it prevents us from making any kind of typing errors and typing mistakes. So I've got some instructions online for installing it yourselves if you were using a Linux instance. But if you're playing along at home, if you want to join in, the best thing to do is just go to that DA desktop link. So let me just grab that and maybe drop that into the chat channel so that if anybody wants to do that and play along, they can. So if you click on that link, it should take you to this area here. So if you've not seen DA Desktop before, it's Noble's online platform for doing training that involves users working with a PC or a particular machine. So it's used a lot for programming sessions. A session like today, what this platform will do is it will allow you to launch a machine. So I've got a trainer machine here. I'm just going to connect to it. If you're playing along at home, you would typically launch a machine of your own. And what it would do is, in a browser, because it's all browser-based, it would launch a, in this case, a Windows machine. And what I've done is I've pre-installed some of the software necessary. So what I've installed on this machine, and when you launch it from your end, you should see something pretty much identical, is a clean Windows machine with a thing called Visual Studio Code installed. Visual Studio Code is it's a text editor. It's a way of writing files. But what I've done is introduced what we call a extension. So the extension for Gherkin is that one there. So it's basically an addition to the text editor, which helps to validate your files. So when you're typing things out, if you make a typing mistake, it will correct that and I'll point it out for you. You don't have to use Visual Studio Code. You can use your editor of choice. If you don't want to connect to DA desktop and you want to join from home or from the office, then just feel free to use TextEdit or a Notepad or something similar. The language is very, very straightforward to use. So what we're going to do, well, what I'm going to do is just create a new file, which I will save as, it's just a test. And if you give it the feature extension, it knows that it's a Gherkin feature file. So I'll save that. Okay, and I've now got my first feature file. So what we're going to do with it? Well, let's write our first feature file based on the notes you gave me earlier in the session. So the feature file and the feature keyword is used to describe a high-level group of scenarios. So if you remember from our notes, we're doing banking, online banking. So what you would do is typically add your first line in here. I'm just going back to my file. So if you do feature, as you'll see there, it knows because of the plugin that I'm using Gherkin syntax, and it's saying, right, okay, for a feature, we need to give it a name. So I'll just call it online banking. Keep it nice and simple. Okay, and what you can do is have some narrative below it. So you have the option of just putting in some descriptions to help people read the file. The powerful thing about BDD and Gherkin and these scenario files and feature files is that they become your documentation. So you don't need to maintain separate documentation because these are the things that are describing the behavior of your system. So I'll say this is a feature file for BDD workshop on online banking. Okay, so that's the first couple of lines of the feature file. What comes next then? Well, what we need to do is give each test scenario name of its own. So the easiest thing to do is to jump back to this file here, look through the acceptance criteria, and let's say, pick the first acceptance criteria. We'll call the scenario money has left the origin account. So jump back to the text editor. So again, if you're playing along at home, give it a scenario, and we'll give it a scenario name. And the scenario name is money has. Oops, one sec. Money has left origin. Okay, so that's the description of the first scenario. What's next and what goes into that scenario? Well, these are the behavioral steps. These are the things that we capture next, the user behavior, and we express them one at a time with the words given, when, then. So given, as I mentioned earlier, is about putting a system into context. So typically it's setting up the system to be in a particular state. So what can we do with this then? What we can do with money has left the origin account is we can say stuff like, given, I have, as I mentioned earlier, 200 in my account. Okay, I can stop there. It's a very simple given situation. So I can set up a system which has 200 in the account. You know, if I was the person testing this scenario, this would be quite easy to recreate. So what am I actually testing then? Well, it's the when, it's the event, it's the action or the behavior that the user takes. So we'll put in something like when I request transfer. And again, you can see I'm just using natural language here. You know, the only keywords are the things in blue, you know, the features, scenarios, given and when. Everything else is just written in plain language. So given I have 200 in my account, when I request to transfer 50 to another account, okay, what I would then expect to see, the then is the expected outcome. And the expected outcome here would be then I see 150 left in my account. Okay, and that there is pretty much your very first feature file. Very, very simple, using plain language, derived from a user story that you guys threw at me. So we've taken it from user story to an acceptance criteria to a scenario. So jumping back to the feature file a second, let me pick up the next one. And the daily limit is 200. So we could have another scenario in the same file, which is called daily limit 200. We can say, oh, okay. So given I have 200 in my account, I'll use the same one, keep it simple. When I, actually, let me make that a bit easier. So let me change this to 300. So that becomes 250. Let me change this one to 300. Just so that I can try and exceed the limit. That's why I'm changing it. So when I request to transfer 201 to another account, then what I expect, well, because this is breaching that limit, I'm given an error. And what you can do with given when then, all of the steps will let you have and, so there could be more than one thing. So and I still have 300 in my account. So you've seen there quite quickly, I've added another scenario to deal with another acceptance criteria. And these things evolve through discussions with users. You're checking with the user, okay, what's the limit? What would you expect to happen? What would you expect to see? You're exploring the user behavior in a lot more depth, and you're capturing a lot more sort of fine-grained detail. Now, it's important to remember that you only get into this level of detail when you're reasonably confident of implementing the story. Because what we don't want to do, you know, if you think of Agile, what you don't want to do is spend a lot of time writing feature files and scenarios for things that you never implement. That's just wasted effort, and it's just non-Agile. So typically you start to add these things when you either start to implement the feature or when you know it's going to be, you know, when you're confident it's going to be implemented. Okay, so that's a very, very basic feature file. We can do other things with these. So we can add comments. So we could put some commentary anywhere in the file. Basically, it's if you use the hashtag, it knows that everything after that is a comment. And we could say user for message text. Yeah, we might be chatting with the users and say, well, okay, what kind of message text would you see? And that would be a reminder that we want to go and see the user. And we can put text file, you know, these comments pretty much wherever we want. And as you can see, they're in green. It just helps you add a bit of description and a bit of narrative to these files. Okay, so we can blah, 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 add more text as much as we want. So what we see here then, just to get it a bit more powerful for a moment, is what we've got is a scenario file that has a what we call single argument. It has single values in there. So in the first scenario, I know it's 300 and I expect to withdraw 50 and I expect to see 250 left. So we're basically hard coding those values into the scenario. And what you see as you write more and more of these things is you want to deal with subtleties in variation. And the way we do that is through passing multiple arguments. And the way we do that is we change that rigid single scenario into a thing called a scenario outline. Okay, and what that says is we can create a scenario outline and then pass it different values. Okay, so we know the daily limit's 200. So what we can do now is say, right, well, we don't want to hard code 300. what we can say is change that for something that can be variable. Okay, so I can say request amount. Okay, so what I can then do down here is add a thing called an example table. And basically examples gives you a table where you can pass different values in. So I know the first one is request amount. So the value was 300. And what it will do is it will substitute request amount for whatever is in the this value table. That makes sense. When I request to transfer 201, so again, rather than having 201 hard coded, I would do, let me just change that. That's not the transfer amount. It's the initial amount. Let me get my terminology right. Because the initial amount is what is in the account currently. This one is the transfer amount. I can type. I can feel all the virtual eyes watching me as I type. So let me just add transfer amount. Okay, it knows about the transfer amount. And what did I say I wanted to do? I wanted to withdraw 201. So what's the expected outcome? Well, I'm giving her a message. So we could even substitute that to be a message, for that to be a variable thing. And we could say down here, message, and under there, because we know it's text, we'd say, right, okay, we want to show the user exceeds daily limit message. And what we want to do then is put in another value, which is what's the amount left. We can add a final thing to our example table called left amount. In there, we can say I've still got 300 in there. So hopefully you've seen there that I've managed to turn a static single scenario file into something that now becomes variable, because what I can then start to add to is this table here. So I can say, right, okay, same initial amount. Okay, but what happens when it is less than the limit? So I can say 199. And because we know 199 is within the daily limit, we can say transfer successful. And we then know that we have, it will be 101 left. And we could go further with this. We could really make this powerful by saying the daily limit becomes variable, because you might have VIP customers and non-VIP customers. Some might be allowed to transfer more, some might be less. You might have business customers who could transfer more, or personal customers who we might want to have different limits on. So again, hopefully you've seen there that a single scenario that I've discussed with the user, you know, based on an acceptance criteria, I've now created two scenarios, one which works, one which doesn't. And ultimately we do this because we feed Gherkin, I'll skip through that for now. We feed these Gherkin scripts into a thing called Cucumber. Now, Cucumber is like a test automation tool which can read Gherkin files. And typically these become part of what we call your continuous integration pipeline, your software development pipeline. And this picture here tries to represent it. So what we typically have is a tool like Jenkins, which is continually building and testing your software. This is an automated process, and that's why BDD is becoming more popular, is because we want all of our tests to become automated. So what we have is test-driven development working. So we have test-driven, which is where the programmers are writing unit tests to make the code work, and tools like JUnit, if you're using Java, is a popular tool in that space. Cucumber and Gherkin fall into that BDD category. So once the program's built, what we want to do is then expose it for testing. And as you've seen through the session today, we can turn these scenarios into automated tests. And what we can do is implement them as part of our CI pipeline. And what I mean by that is we're continually running functional tests alongside some of these more technical unit testing. And ultimately, the collection of the two makes your product much more robust much more tested, much more high quality. You're capturing issues a lot sooner. Continuous integration is the technical process of doing that. And if you want to know more about this, this is a big part of what we cover in our DevOps training sessions. CI/CD pipelines are a big part of DevOps. And the reason for doing a session on BDD today is just to show you the steps involved in getting functional user scenarios into your test automation pipeline. So I'd like to end there and leave it open to any questions.
Yeah, please use the chat box. You should be able to use your microphone at this point in time as well. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay, so typical question. Yeah, I'm saying how much effort's involved in this? Well, it is a bit more effort to capture your scenarios up front when you're talking with the users, but the additional time it takes to do that is normally, you know, it far outweighs the amount of manual testing and user acceptance testing and functional testing that you would typically do. If you work with your users, capture these scenarios, automate them, and run that automation, then, you know, it's took a little bit of extra upfront time, but you can then run those test cases over and over and over again. What you're not doing is like things like manual user acceptance testing. You know, what we're trying to capture in these scenarios is those user acceptance tests. You know, what would the user do to test the system? And what we do through BDD is capture those and we automate them. And, you know, the time investment, you know, you get a lot of payback through the resulting test automation. Again, another line, yeah, I mean, BDD is platform agnostic. So you write the scenario files with your users in plain text. You can get quite powerful with the variables and with the example tables. And what you can do is use either Cucumber as a tool. There's other BDD tools. So tools like HP, Test Complete, you know, things like this. They can all take in scenario files. They can use them as an input, which you can then implement the automated test for. So even though I sort of showed Cucumber in the slide here, Cucumber isn't the only test tool out there. Cucumber is a Ruby-based test tool, and you see it a lot when the people are using Ruby as a language, but it doesn't matter. Whatever your test tool, whatever you've invested in, you can usually feed in these scenario files. The key thing is getting those scenarios right and having conversations with your users to capture some of those, some of this detail. Okay. Okay, Rog, I don't think there's any more questions coming through.
No questions.
Can I hand back to yourself to close down the session?
Okay. Well, thank you, Craig, for your presentation today. Very interesting, very concise. Thank you for joining us this morning on this BDD workshop session. If you do have an interest in using the virtual environment that we've created for this session, feel free to use the link which you find in your chat box. It will be available today and tomorrow, so you can play around with Cucumber if you like to. If you have any inquiry regarding BDD training or anything related to DevOps, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you out with any requirement you may have. Okay, with this, I will close down the session. Thank you again for joining, and I hope to see you again in our next sessions, which will be in 2 weeks on RPA. So if you do have some requirements on RPA, feel free to join us again in 2 weeks' time. Thanks again. See you next time.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.
Bye.